The dust devil swirled down Main Street that scorching August afternoon in Cedar Falls, Montana territory, carrying with it the bitter scent of desperation and the kind of heat that made decent folks seek shade and indecent ones look for opportunity. But it wasn't the oppressive sun that made the handful of passersby quicken their steps and avoid eye contact. It was the sight of a small figure hunched against the weathered brick wall of Murphy's General Store, motionless as a discarded doll, with a crudely painted sign hanging around her neck that made grown men's stomachs turn and women cross themselves before hurrying past. "Not worth feeding," the sign declared in bold black letters, the paint still wet enough to catch the light. Below it sat 12-year-old Lily Chen, her mixed heritage evident in features that carried both her Chinese father's gentle eyes and her Irish mother's stubborn chin. 3 days without food had left her too weak to brush away the flies that settled on her unwashed hair, too exhausted to care that her makeshift dress sewn from flour sacks had torn at the shoulder, revealing the purple bruises that told their own story of systematic cruelty. The town's newest form of public execution was psychological rather than physical, a method Mayor Edmund Hartwell had devised for dealing with what he called surplus inventory from his profitable orphan work program. The children who could no longer perform their assigned labor, who'd grown too sick or too defiant or simply too expensive to maintain, were marked with these signs and left to die slowly in full view of a community that had learned to look the other way. It was efficient, legal in the loosest interpretation of territorial law, and most importantly, it sent a clear message to the other children about the cost of becoming inconvenient. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Thompson reined in his weary horse at the edge of Cedar Falls' main thoroughfare, squinting through the dust and heat, haze at what he'd initially mistaken for a pile of discarded rags. The sun had beaten down mercilessly on his shoulders during the 3-day ride from Billings, where his last job herding cattle for the Northern Pacific Railroad had ended with the usual handshake, modest pay, and the understanding that a man like him, rootless, carrying too many ghosts, and possessing an unfortunate tendency to speak up when witnessing injustice, wasn't welcome to linger long in any one place. At 34, Jake had perfected the art of being forgettable. Average height, brown hair that had seen too much sun and too little care, clothes that were clean but clearly well worn, and the kind of weathered face that suggested hard living. Without revealing its specifics, he'd learned to keep his opinions to himself, take his wages without complaint, and move on before anyone got curious about why a man with his obvious skills chose to drift between temporary jobs rather than settle down with steady work. The war had taken some men's lives, others' limbs, and from Jake Thompson it had extracted something harder to name but impossible to replace: the ability to believe that staying in one place wouldn't eventually lead to loss too painful to bear. His horse, a patient bay mare named Constance whom he'd won in a poker game 2 years prior, picked her way carefully down the rutted Main Street while Jake's experienced eye cataloged the town's particulars. Cedar Falls was typical of a dozen other settlements he'd passed through in recent years: false-fronted buildings that promised more prosperity than they delivered, a main street wide enough for freight wagons but rarely busy enough to justify the space, and the particular combination of hope and resignation that characterized communities still fighting to prove their permanence in an unforgiving landscape. The general store anchored one end of the commercial district, its windows displaying an optimistic array of goods that suggested either genuine prosperity or desperate ambition. Across the street, the brass rail saloon's batwing doors hung motionless in the still air, while further down the block a small church steeple rose against the endless sky like a prayer made manifest in wood and faith. It was the kind of place where a man could find a few days' work, a decent meal, and a clean bed before the inevitable moment when staying longer became more complicated than leaving. But as Constance drew closer to the general store, Jake's attention fixed on the small figure slumped against the building's brick wall. Distance and the shimmering heat had initially obscured details, but now he could make out the crude lettering on the sign hanging around the child's neck, and the words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He'd witnessed plenty of cruelty during his wandering years towns, where the strong preyed on the weak with impunity, where economic desperation bred moral compromise, where turning a blind eye to injustice had become a survival skill as essential as reading weather signs or judging horseflesh. But this was different. This was a child, barely old enough to understand the forces that had brought her to this moment, being slowly murdered by systematic neglect, while an entire community pretended not to see. The sign around her neck wasn't just a death sentence. It was an advertisement, a public declaration that this small life had been officially deemed worthless by whatever authority governed such decisions in Cedar Falls. Worse still, the fact that she remained unmolested by the few passersby suggested this wasn't an aberration, but an accepted practice, a routine disposal method that had been normalized through repetition and collective moral cowardice. Jake dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening as he approached the girl. She didn't look up immediately, and he realized with a stab of recognition that she'd learned the same survival strategy he'd mastered, becoming invisible, drawing no attention, existing in the spaces between other people's notice. Her dark hair hung in unwashed tangles around a face that would have been pretty under better circumstances, but malnutrition had sharpened her features and exhaustion had dulled eyes that should have sparkled with childhood curiosity and mischief. "Miss," he said quietly, crouching down to bring himself closer to her eye level. The movement was careful, unthreatening, the same approach he'd use with a frightened animal. "When did you last have something to eat?" The question seemed to surprise her more than his presence. She looked up with eyes that carried far too much wariness for someone her age, studying his face with the calculating assessment of someone who'd learned that adult attention usually meant trouble. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound emerged, and Jake realized she might be too weak for conversation, or too frightened to risk drawing additional attention to herself. From his saddlebags, Jake retrieved a piece of hardtack and a small canteen of water, holding them out with the same patience he'd learned to employ when dealing with spooked cattle or injured horses. Trust, he'd discovered, was a luxury that frightened creatures couldn't afford to give freely, and this girl had clearly learned to view adult kindness with suspicion. The fact that she hadn't immediately fled or called for help suggested either profound weakness or the deeper resignation of someone who no longer believed rescue was possible. "Go on," he said gently, placing the food and water within her reach but not forcing the interaction. "Take your time. Nobody's watching, right?" Now, that last observation wasn't entirely accurate. Through his peripheral vision, Jake could see curtains twitching in windows, shopkeepers pausing in doorways, and the subtle shift in pedestrian traffic that indicated his presence had been noted and was being discussed. Cedar Falls might be remote, but it was still a small town where strangers drew attention and unusual behavior became conversation within hours. His decision to acknowledge the girl's existence, much less offer her food, was already marking him as either dangerously naive or potentially troublesome. The girl's thin fingers closed around the hardtack with startling quickness, but she didn't immediately eat. Instead, she broke off a small piece and chewed it slowly, methodically, with the careful discipline of someone who'd learned to make meager rations last as long as possible. Between tiny bites, she sipped from the canteen, her eyes never leaving Jake's face as if expecting him to snatch the sustenance away or demand payment she couldn't provide. "What's your name?" Jake asked after she'd managed several mouthfuls, and some of the desperate hunger had faded from her expression. "Lily," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "Lily Chen." The surname confirmed what Jake had already suspected from her features. She was one of the mixed heritage children, whose very existence challenged the racial certainties that many frontier communities used to organize their social hierarchies. Chinese immigration had brought cultural tensions to many Western territories, and the children born from relationships between Chinese men and white women often found themselves belonging fully to neither community, vulnerable to prejudices from multiple directions simultaneously. "I'm Jake Thompson," he replied, settling more comfortably onto his heels to indicate he wasn't planning to rush away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Been traveling for a few days, and this seems like a decent place to rest my horse and maybe find some work. You know, if there's anyone in town hiring hands for ranch work or cattle drives. The question was deliberately casual, an attempt to normalize their conversation and perhaps extract information about Cedar Falls' economic and social structures without seeming to interrogate her. But Lily's response was a slight shake of her head, followed by words that carried implications far darker than a simple lack of employment opportunities. "Ain't nobody gonna hire you if they see you talking to me," she said matter-of-factly, her young voice carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who'd learned to understand adult politics through painful experience. "Mayor says I'm diseased now. Says anyone who helps me might catch what I got." The explanation struck Jake as both transparently false and brilliantly effective. By labeling unwanted children as disease carriers, whoever had devised this system had created a self-enforcing isolation that prevented community members from offering help without appearing to challenge official medical authority. It was a more sophisticated form of social control than Jake had encountered in most frontier towns, suggesting either unusual intelligence among the local leadership or guidance from someone with experience in managing populations through fear and misinformation. "What kind of disease?" Jake asked, his tone remaining conversational despite the anger building in his chest. Lily shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of a child who'd stopped expecting adult decisions to make sense. "Don't know. Just that I can't work no more, can't live with the other kids, can't be around decent folks. Mayor says I'm used up." The casual cruelty of that final phrase, "used up," revealed volumes about how Cedar Falls leadership viewed the children under their supposed care. These weren't young people being prepared for productive adult lives. They were resources to be exploited until they were no longer profitable, then disposed of as efficiently as possible. The sign around Lily's neck wasn't really about feeding. It was about marking her as officially worthless, beyond the protection of community morality or Christian charity. Jake found himself studying the girl's face more carefully, looking for signs of whatever condition had supposedly rendered her unemployable. What he saw instead was intelligence, determination, and the kind of quiet strength that suggested she'd been fighting longer and harder than most adults ever had to. The bruises on her visible skin spoke to recent violence, but her posture and the way she held his gaze indicated an unbroken spirit that someone had clearly decided was more dangerous than useful. "How long you been sitting here?" he asked. 3 days, Lily replied, taking another careful sip from the canteen. "Maybe 4. Hard to tell when you ain't sleeping much." 3 days without food in the August heat should have killed her, or at least left her unconscious. The fact that she was still alert and responsive suggested either remarkable physical resilience or that someone had been secretly providing minimal assistance despite the official prohibition. Either possibility indicated that Cedar Falls' cruel system wasn't as universally accepted as its architects might believe, which meant potential allies existed if Jake decided to make this his business rather than simply another sad story to forget once he moved on to the next town. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Jake's consideration of his limited options. A heavy-set man in a sheriff's badge was walking toward them with the purposeful stride of someone exercising official authority, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm in a gesture that managed to appear both relaxed and threatening simultaneously. Behind him followed a thin woman dressed in expensive clothes that seemed deliberately designed to advertise prosperity and social position. Her face set in an expression of righteous disapproval that suggested she viewed Jake's presence as a personal affront to proper order. "Afternoon, stranger," the sheriff said with false heartiness that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Sheriff Clarence Murphy, and this here's Mrs. Gertrude Blackwood. We help keep Cedar Falls running smooth for folks just passing through." The introduction carried implications beyond simple politeness. Murphy and Blackwood weren't just introducing themselves. They were identifying the local power structure and making it clear that Jake's presence had been noted by the people who made decisions about whether strangers were welcome to remain in town. The fact that they'd approached him within minutes of his arrival suggested either impressive efficiency or that someone had been specifically watching for any interaction with the marked child. "Jake Thompson," he replied, standing slowly with his hands visible and unthreatening. "Just looking for a place to rest my horse and maybe find some work before moving on. Heard there might be ranching opportunities in this area." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as authoritative pronouncements. She was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed in a way that suggested either inherited wealth or profitable business ventures, and she carried herself with the particular combination of moral certainty and social superiority that Jake had learned to recognize as dangerous in small-town politics. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of someone who'd received formal education and wanted others to know it, "I'm afraid you've inadvertently placed yourself in a compromising position. The child you've been speaking with is under official quarantine for communicable disease. Contact with her puts both your health and that of our entire community at risk." The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that Jake almost admired its audacity. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't simply claiming medical authority. She was positioning herself as protector of public health while simultaneously explaining why helping Lily was not just inadvisable but actively harmful to innocent people. It was a masterful piece of manipulation that transformed potential Good Samaritans into threats against community welfare. "What kind of disease?" Jake asked, echoing his earlier question to Lily but directing it toward the supposed medical authority. Sheriff Murphy's hand shifted slightly closer to his weapon. "The kind that spreads easy and kills slow," he said, with the finality of someone who didn't expect his pronouncements to be questioned. "Doc Sterling examined her personal and determined she ain't fit for contact with healthy folks. City ordinance requires anyone with her condition to be isolated until natural causes resolve the situation." The euphemism "natural causes resolve" the situation was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire conversation. These people weren't just willing to let a child die. They'd created an official framework that made her death sound like an inevitable medical outcome rather than deliberate murder through neglect. They'd bureaucratized cruelty, turning systematic child abuse into civic responsibility and transforming community indifference into public health policy. Jake felt the familiar weight of moral choice settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He could apologize for his mistake, mount Constance, and ride out of Cedar Falls within the hour, adding Lily Chen to the growing list of injustices he'd witnessed but been powerless to address. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the reasonable decision for a man whose survival depended on avoiding entanglements with local power structures and moving on before anyone got curious about his past or his reasons for avoiding permanent attachments. But as he looked down at Lily, still clutching the hardtack like it might be snatched away at any moment, Jake found himself remembering another child from another time, a boy whose trust in adult protection had been shattered by the same kind of systematic cruelty that now threatened to claim this girl's life. The memory carried with it all the weight of choices not made, interventions not attempted, and the bitter knowledge that sometimes standing aside was just another form of participation in evil. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Each second waited with the implications of Jake's next words. Sheriff Murphy's fingers drummed against his gun belt with practiced casualness, while Mrs. Blackwood's pale eyes studied Jake's face with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to reading men's intentions and finding their weaknesses. Behind them, Lily had gone perfectly still, understanding with the intuitive wisdom of the powerless that her fate hung in the balance of whatever decision this stranger was about to make. Jake Thompson had spent the better part of 15 years perfecting the art of walking away from other people's troubles. The skill had been hard-won through bitter experience, carved into his character by losses too painful to examine closely, and refined through countless encounters with injustice that he'd learned to classify as none of his business. The war had taught him that heroic gestures usually got good men killed, while changing nothing substantial about the underlying problems that created suffering in the first place. The years since had reinforced that lesson through encounters with corrupt officials, exploitative employers, and communities where speaking up for the vulnerable marked a man as either dangerous or naive. Yet something about this particular moment felt different, weighted with significance that extended beyond the immediate question of whether to help one abandoned child. Perhaps it was the calculated sophistication of the cruelty he was witnessing, the way Cedar Falls had transformed child murder into medical policy, bureaucratized evil until it wore the mask of civic responsibility. Or maybe it was the way Lily held herself, clearly terrified, but refusing to beg or grovel, maintaining dignity even while wearing a sign that declared her worthless. Most likely, it was the unwelcome recognition that his carefully constructed philosophy of non-involvement was really just elaborate justification for moral cowardice. The realization brought with it memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. Images of another time, another place, another child who'd needed protection that never came. The war had been full of such moments, opportunities to intervene, chances to stand between the powerful and the powerless, decisions that seemed clear in retrospect but had been clouded by fear, confusion, and a desperate desire to survive. Jake had made his choices then, lived with the consequences, and built a life around, ensuring he'd never again be in a position where someone else's survival depended on his courage. But here he was anyway, standing in a dusty Montana street, with a dying child at his feet and two representatives of institutional cruelty, waiting to see whether he'd challenge their authority or slink away like a sensible man. The familiar weight of decision pressed down on him, bringing with it the bitter knowledge that neutrality was itself a choice, that standing aside was just another form of participation in whatever happened next. Sheriff Murphy cleared his throat with theatrical patience. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sure you understand our position here. Cedar Falls is a law-abiding community, and we take our responsibilities to public health very seriously. Now I'm willing to overlook this little misunderstanding, considering you're new to our ways, but I need you to step away from the child and move along. There's nothing here that concerns a traveling man." The offer was generous by the standards of frontier justice, a chance to extract himself from the situation without consequences, to remount his horse and disappear down the trail with nothing worse than an uncomfortable memory to add to his collection. Jake could feel the familiar pull of self-preservation, the rational voice that had kept him alive through war and wandering by counseling caution over conscience, survival over sentiment. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with the confident smile of someone who'd successfully intimidated countless potential troublemakers. "Perhaps we could interest you in some refreshment at the hotel while your horse rests. Cedar Falls takes pride in treating visitors with proper hospitality, and I'm sure we could find some suitable employment for a man with your obvious experience." The carrot offered alongside the stick comfort, work, acceptance into the community's good graces in exchange for ignoring its crimes. Jake recognized the sophisticated nature of the manipulation, the way these people had refined their control. Techniques beyond simple threats to include positive incentives for cooperation. They weren't just bullies. They were architects of a system that made participation in evil seem like reasonable self-interest. But as Jake looked down at Lily's upturned face, he found himself remembering not just his own failures, but also the moments when someone had chosen differently. The sergeant who'd risked court-martial to share his rations with starving civilians. The widow who'd hidden runaway slaves despite laws that would have seen her imprisoned. The schoolteacher who'd continued educating Indian children even after territorial authorities had forbidden it. All people who'd understood that some lines couldn't be crossed without losing something essential about what it meant to be human. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, his voice carrying none of the decision that was crystallizing in his mind. "But I'm curious about something. You mentioned this child has a communicable disease. What exactly are the symptoms?" The question caught both officials slightly off guard. Mrs. Blackwood's confident expression flickered momentarily before reasserting itself. "The medical details are quite complex, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Sterling is our local authority on such matters. And I'm sure he'd be happy to explain the situation if you're genuinely interested in public health. However, I hardly think, because she looks more hungry than sick to me." Jake interrupted, his tone remaining conversational despite the challenge implicit in his words. "And that sign around her neck seems more concerned with feeding than with contagion. Makes a man wonder whether this is really about disease or about something else entirely." Sheriff Murphy's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Mr. Thompson, I think you'd better be very careful about the accusations you're making. We don't take kindly to strangers questioning our medical authorities or implying that our civic leaders aren't acting in good faith." The threat was explicit now, the friendly facade dropping away to reveal the iron underneath. Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence, his body automatically shifting into the balanced stance that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. But this time, instead of planning his escape route, he found himself calculating whether he could draw his own weapon quickly enough to protect both himself and the girl if the situation escalated. "I'm not questioning anybody's authority," Jake replied with deliberate mildness. "Just trying to understand the situation before I make any decisions about where to spend my time and money. A man likes to know what kind of place he's visiting." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with the sharp intelligence of someone who recognized a more sophisticated opponent than she'd initially assumed. "And what kind of place do you think Cedar Falls is, Mr. Thompson?" The question was a test, Jake realized. They were evaluating whether he was simply naive or genuinely dangerous to their operations. His answer would determine whether they continued trying to manage him through incentives and threats, or escalated to more direct methods of persuasion. The knowledge that his next words would likely seal not just his own fate, but Lily's as well, should have terrified him. Instead, he found it oddly liberating. "Seems like the kind of place where good people might be too scared to do the right thing," Jake said quietly. "Where folks have learned to look the other way when convenient. Where children get turned into problems that need solving rather than people who need protecting." The words hung in the afternoon air like gunsmoke. Sheriff Murphy's face darkened with anger, while Mrs. Blackwood's expression shifted to something colder and more calculating. Behind them, Jake could sense the attention of other townspeople, drawn by the unusual spectacle of someone openly challenging the local power structure. Windows that had been merely cracked open were now pushed wider. Pedestrians who'd been hurrying past had slowed their pace or stopped entirely. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Blackwood said with icy precision, "I believe you've misunderstood our community's character. Cedar Falls is a God-fearing, law-abiding town where decent people work hard to build better lives for their families. We don't appreciate outsiders making inflammatory accusations based on ignorance and prejudice." "Prejudice?" Jake repeated, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Against who exactly?" The question seemed to surprise her, Mrs. Blackwood glanced quickly at Sheriff Murphy before responding. Against people who understand that difficult decisions sometimes require difficult actions. Against communities that refuse to let misguided sentimentality override practical necessity. Jake nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering her perspective. So the practical necessity here is letting a 12-year-old girl die of starvation in public. The practical necessity, Sheriff Murphy interjected harshly, is maintaining order and preventing the spread of disease that could kill dozens of innocent people. Now I've been patient with you, stranger, but my patience has limits. But Jake was looking past the sheriff now, studying the faces of the townspeople who'd gathered to watch this confrontation. What he saw there wasn't the uniform support that Murphy and Blackwood seemed to expect. Instead, he recognized the expressions of people caught between fear and conscience, community members who understood that what they were witnessing was wrong, but felt powerless to oppose it. Some faces showed genuine indifference or even approval, but others carried the guilty discomfort of people complicit in something they couldn't quite justify to themselves. Most importantly, Jake could see recognition in several sets of eyes, the understanding that someone was finally saying what they'd been thinking, but hadn't dared to voice. A middle-aged woman standing outside the general store was nodding almost imperceptibly. An older man leaning against a hitching post had straightened up with what looked like hope. Even the young clerk sweeping the boardwalk outside the bank had stopped working to listen. The realization that opposition to Cedar Falls' system existed, but had simply been suppressed, changed Jake's calculation entirely. This wasn't a case of one man standing against an entire community. It was a situation where the community's own conscience had been held hostage by a small group of people who'd gained control through fear and intimidation. The question wasn't whether intervention was possible, but whether someone was willing to provide the catalyst that would allow decent people to remember their own values. "Tell me something," Jake said, addressing his words to the growing crowd rather than just the officials. "How many children have worn signs like this one? How many have been left to die while good people walked past because they were told it was for the greater good?" Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward sharply. "That's quite enough. Sheriff Murphy, I believe Mr. Thompson has made his intentions clear. Perhaps it's time to discuss this matter more privately." But Jake was already moving, crouching down beside Lily and gently lifting the degrading sign from around her neck. The action was simple, almost mundane, but it carried symbolic weight that resonated through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water. He wasn't just removing a piece of cardboard. He was publicly rejecting the authority that had placed it there, challenging the entire system that had declared this child disposable. "Stand up, Miss Lily," he said quietly, offering her his hand. "Time to get you some real food and a safe place to rest." The girl's fingers were thin and cold when they closed around his, but her grip was surprisingly strong. As she rose unsteadily to her feet, Jake could hear the collective intake of breath from the watching townspeople. Someone was actually doing something. After months or perhaps years of watching helplessly as children disappeared or died, someone was finally taking action. Sheriff Murphy's hand closed around the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Thompson, you're interfering with official medical quarantine procedures. That constitutes a violation of territorial health codes and puts this entire community at risk. I'm ordering you to step away from the child immediately." Jake stood slowly, keeping Lily slightly behind him while facing the two officials. The moment felt crystalline, suspended in time like the instant before a gunfight, when all possibilities narrowed down to a single choice between courage and cowardice. Everything that happened next would flow from this decision, and Jake found himself oddly calm as he made it. "Sheriff," he said with quiet authority, "I don't see a sick child here. I see a hungry one. And I don't recognize any law that requires letting children starve to death in public. So unless you're planning to arrest me for offering food to someone who needs it, I suggest you step aside." Part 3. The child's story unfolds. The confrontation might have escalated to violence if not for the intervention of an unexpected voice from the crowd. Sheriff Murphy, perhaps we should hear what the child has to say about her condition. The speaker was a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the practical dress of someone who worked for a living rather than managing others' labor. She stepped forward with the careful confidence of someone taking a calculated risk, her hands clasped firmly in front of her, as if to prevent them from trembling. "Mrs. Martinez," Mrs. Blackwood said with sharp disapproval, "this is not a matter for public discussion. Dr. Sterling has made his diagnosis, and the proper authorities have taken appropriate action." But Rosa Martinez had clearly decided that this moment was worth whatever consequences might follow. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Blackwood, but I've been serving meals at the cafe for 12 years, and I know what hungry looks like. I also know what sick looks like, and this child appears to be suffering from one, but not the other." Her intervention had a galvanizing effect on the crowd. Other voices began to murmur agreement, and Jake could see people edging closer. No longer content to watch from safe distances. The spell of intimidation that had kept the community silent was beginning to crack, and Mrs. Blackwood's expression suggested she recognized the danger this represented to her carefully maintained control. "Rosa Martinez," Sheriff Murphy said, with heavy emphasis on her name, "you'd better think carefully before you start making accusations about medical professionals and elected officials. Folks who spread rumors about public health matters sometimes find themselves facing serious legal consequences." The threat was clear, but Rosa had already committed herself to the path of resistance. "I'm not spreading rumors, Sheriff. I'm asking questions that any decent person would want answered. Like why a child who is healthy enough to work in Mrs. Blackwood's laundry just last week is suddenly too diseased to be around other people." Jake felt Lily's grip tighten on his hand, and he looked down to see fear flickering across her features. But when Rosa mentioned the laundry, something else appeared in the girl's expression, spark of anger that suggested there was more to this story than simple medical quarantine. "Miss Lily," Jake said gently, "would you like to tell these people what really happened? Why you're not working at the laundry anymore?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for her age. "You sure you want to know? Might be you won't like me much after." "I'm sure," Jake replied firmly. "And I don't think anything you tell me is going to change my opinion about who deserves help and who doesn't." Lily glanced around at the crowd that had gathered, taking in faces that ranged from hostile to curious to genuinely sympathetic. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "I was working the big washing machines at Mrs. Blackwood's place," she began, her words coming slowly as if she were choosing each one carefully. "Been there since I was 10, when they said I was old enough for real work. Wasn't bad work mostly. Hard, but I'm strong for my size, and I learned quick how to handle the equipment without getting hurt." Mrs. Blackwood's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "The child was indeed employed in our commercial laundry operation, which provides valuable training for orphan children while contributing to their upkeep. However, her condition deteriorated to the point where she's lying," Lily said with startling directness, her young voice cutting through Mrs. Blackwood's explanation like a knife. "I wasn't sick at all. I got marked because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and when they tried to make me keep quiet about it, I refused." The admission sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. Jake could see several people exchanging meaningful glances, as if Lily's words had confirmed suspicions they'd been harboring but hadn't dared to voice. Sheriff Murphy's hand moved to rest openly on his weapon now, abandoning any pretense of casual authority. "What did you see?" Rosa Martinez asked, her voice encouraging but gentle. Lily looked up at Jake again, seeking some kind of permission or reassurance. When he nodded encouragingly, she took a deep breath and continued her story. "Last week, I was working late because one of the big machines had broken down, and Mrs. Blackwood said we needed to catch up on the hotel laundry before morning. Most of the other kids had gone to bed, but I stayed because—" She paused, her voice becoming even quieter. "Because if you work extra, sometimes they give you better food the next day." The casual mention of food being used as incentive for extra labor revealed volumes about the conditions these children faced daily. Jake found himself wondering how many adults in Cedar Falls knew about the systematic exploitation happening under their noses, and how many had simply chosen not to think about it too carefully. I was in the back room, hanging up sheets to dry, when I heard voices from Mrs. Blackwood's office. She was talking to Mayor Hartwell and Dr. Sterling about money, about how much the territorial government pays for each orphan they take care of, and how much extra they could make by renting US out to local businesses. Mrs. Blackwood took a sharp step forward. "That's quite enough wild storytelling from a disturbed child. Sheriff Murphy, I believe we've indulged this charade long enough." But Lily continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. They were talking about the kids who'd gotten too old or too sick to work anymore. Dr. Sterling was explaining how he could write medical certificates, saying they had diseases, so the town wouldn't have to keep spending money feeding them. He said it was more efficient than the old way. What was the old way? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lily's face went very still. They used to just disappear kids at night, take them out to the old mine shafts up in the hills. But Dr. Sterling said that was risky because people might ask questions if too many children went missing at once. The disease certificates made it look legal. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and terrible. Jake could see the knowledge hitting the assembled townspeople like physical blows, forcing them to confront the true nature of what had been happening in their community. Some faces showed genuine shock, suggesting they'd suspected economic exploitation, but hadn't imagined the extent of the murders. Others displayed the guilty recognition of people who'd known more than they'd admitted to themselves. Dr. Vincent Sterling chose that moment to arrive on the scene, presumably summoned by someone who'd recognized that the situation was spiraling beyond Murphy and Blackwood's ability to control. He was a thin man in his 50s with the kind of precisely trimmed beard and expensive clothes that suggested prosperity and professional authority. His arrival was clearly intended to provide medical credibility to whatever explanation would be offered for Lily's condition. "Ah, Dr. Sterling," Mrs. Blackwood said with obvious relief. "Perhaps you could explain to these people the serious nature of this child's condition and the public health risks involved in Mr. Thompson's irresponsible behavior." Dr. Sterling stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. He barely glanced at Lily before addressing the crowd, in the authoritative tone that frontier communities had learned to associate with medical expertise. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've examined this child extensively, and I can assure you that she's suffering from a highly contagious condition that poses significant risks to anyone who comes into close contact with her. The isolation protocols we've implemented are standard medical practice for preventing the spread of such diseases." Jake looked down at Lily, who was staring at the doctor with undisguised hatred. "Miss Lily, would you like to tell Dr. Sterling what you saw him doing?" "Mrs. Blackwood's office?" The girl's voice was steady now, no longer the whisper of someone afraid to speak. "I saw him counting money, lots of money. And I heard him telling Mrs. Blackwood and Mayor Hartwell that he could make the death certificates look natural, so nobody would investigate. He said he'd been doing it for other towns, and Cedar Falls could make a lot more profit if they stopped trying to keep the used-up kids alive." Dr. Sterling's face flushed red. "This is preposterous. The ravings of a clearly disturbed child who's been traumatized by her illness. I categorically deny these malicious fabrications." But Rosa Martinez was studying the doctor's expression with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent years reading people's faces across a cafe counter. "Dr. Sterling, if this child is as sick as you claim, why haven't any of the other children who work with her shown symptoms?" Contagious diseases usually spread pretty fast in close quarters. The question was simple but devastating in its implications. If Lily truly suffered from a communicable disease, the other orphans should have been affected by now. The fact that they remained healthy suggested either that the disease was fabricated or that the isolation had nothing to do with medical concerns. Dr. Sterling stammered for a moment before regaining his composure. The incubation period for this particular condition can vary significantly between individuals. The other children are being monitored closely, and appropriate measures will be taken if symptoms develop. Jake felt something shifting in the crowd around them. The careful neutrality that had characterized most of the townspeople was giving way to something more engaged and potentially dangerous to the established order. People were no longer just watching. They were listening, thinking, and beginning to ask their own questions. Dr. Sterling called out an older man whom Jake didn't recognize. "My grandson works in the hotel kitchen, and he mentioned that several children have disappeared over the past year. Said they just stopped showing up for work one day, and nobody would explain where they'd gone. That normal for your contagious disease?" The question opened floodgates that had apparently been holding back months or years of suppressed concerns. Other voices began calling out similar observations and questions. "My wife does sewing work for the laundry, and she said the number of children working there has dropped by more than half since last spring. The boy who used to help at the blacksmith shop disappeared 3 months ago. Nobody would tell his friend what happened. I've been wondering why we never see any older orphans anymore. Used to be, you'd see teenagers working around town, but now they all seem to be children." The pattern that emerged from these accumulated observations was damning. Cedar Falls' orphan population was being systematically reduced through methods that left no witnesses and generated no official investigations. The adults who'd been too frightened or too busy to ask questions individually were discovering that their collective knowledge painted a picture of deliberate murder disguised as medical necessity. Mrs. Blackwood recognized the danger and attempted to regain control of the narrative. These are exactly the kind of wild conspiracy theories that arise when people allow emotion to override medical expertise. Dr. Sterling has explained the situation clearly, and I'd suggest that responsible citizens focus on supporting proper authorities rather than encouraging a disturbed child's fantasies. But Jake could see that the moment for authoritative pronouncements had passed. The crowd was no longer looking to the established leadership for guidance. They were beginning to think for themselves and reach their own conclusions. The spell of intimidation that had kept Cedar Falls compliant was breaking down under the weight of accumulated evidence and the example of people willing to speak truth publicly. "There's something else," Lily said, her voice carrying clearly. Now that she'd found her courage, they keep ledgers. Books with names and amounts and dates. Mrs. Blackwood writes down how much money comes in from the territorial government for each child, and how much they make renting us out to businesses. And Dr. Sterling keeps records of which children get marked for disposal and when. The mention of written records sent a visible shock through both the officials and the crowd. Documentation meant evidence that could be examined by outside authorities, proof that would be much harder to dismiss than verbal accusations. Jake could see calculation flickering across Mrs. Blackwood's face as she realized that their system's bureaucratic thoroughness might have created the very evidence needed to destroy it. "That's quite enough," Sheriff Murphy said with finality, his patience clearly exhausted. "Mr. Thompson, you're under arrest for interfering with official medical procedures and inciting public disorder. The child will be returned to proper medical supervision immediately." But as Murphy stepped forward to carry out his threat, something unexpected happened. Rosa Martinez moved to place herself between the sheriff and Jake, her cafe apron fluttering. in the afternoon breeze like a flag of defiance. "Sheriff," she said with quiet authority, "I don't think you want to arrest a man for trying to help a hungry child. Especially not in front of half the town." Murphy paused, clearly recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond simple intimidation. The crowd had grown larger and more engaged, and several people had moved closer to the confrontation rather than backing away from potential trouble. The political calculus of using force against someone trying to help a child was becoming complicated. "Rosa, you'd better step aside before you find yourself facing charges too," Murphy warned. But instead of stepping aside, Rosa was joined by the older man who'd asked about the missing children, then by a woman Jake didn't recognize, then by several others, until a small but determined group of townspeople had positioned themselves between the officials and their intended targets. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Jake felt something that might have been hope. Part 4. The system's true nature revealed. The standoff that developed in Cedar Falls Main Street was unlike anything Jake had witnessed in his years of wandering through frontier communities. Usually, when locals confronted established authority, the outcome was predetermined by superior firepower and legal backing. But this situation felt different, charged with the particular tension that arose when ordinary people discovered they outnumbered their oppressors and began to question why they'd been afraid for so long. Sheriff Murphy found himself facing not just one defiant stranger, but a growing circle of his own neighbors, people whose taxes paid his salary and whose votes had put Mayor Hartwell in office. The political mathematics of frontier law enforcement depended on community consent, and that consent was visibly eroding with each passing moment. His hand remained on his weapon, but drawing it against fellow citizens who were protecting a child would cross lines that even corrupt officials had to consider carefully. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with the decisive authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations through force of personality and social pressure. "I want everyone to think very carefully about what's happening here," she announced in her most commanding voice. "You're allowing yourselves to be manipulated by the emotional appeals of a stranger and the fabrications of a mentally disturbed child. The consequences of this mob behavior will be severe and long-lasting." But Rosa Martinez had found her own authority now, speaking with the moral certainty of someone who'd finally chosen to act on long-suppressed convictions. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've been watching what happens to the children in this town for years, and I've been ashamed of myself for staying quiet, but I'm not staying quiet anymore." The declaration seemed to liberate others who'd been struggling with similar moral conflicts. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her as she spoke. "My name is Martha Henderson, and I've lived in Cedar Falls for 23 years. I've watched children disappear from this town with increasing frequency, and I've listened to explanations that made less sense each time. I think it's time we demanded better answers than we've been getting." Her words carried the particular authority that came with long residence and community standing. Jake could see the impact they had on both the officials and the gathered townspeople. This wasn't just a stranger causing trouble. This was a respected community member, publicly voicing doubts about the local power structure. Dr. Sterling attempted to reassert medical authority. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand your concerns, but medical matters require professional expertise to evaluate properly. The emotional trauma of seeing sick children can sometimes lead to misinterpretation of necessary medical procedures." But Martha Henderson had clearly moved beyond accepting such explanations. "Dr. Sterling, I buried 2 children of my own to scarlet fever back in Kansas, so I know what sick children look like. And I know what dead children look like. What I don't understand is why the children who disappear from this town never get proper funerals, never have graves that families can visit, never leave any trace that they ever existed." The observation struck the crowd like a physical blow. In frontier communities, Death was a public event that involved the entire population in grieving and burial rituals. The absence of such ceremonies for the disappeared children was an omission, so glaring that it required willful blindness to ignore. Jake felt Lily's hand tighten in his as the conversation continued around them. Looking down, he could see both hope and terror warring in her expression. Hope that someone might finally hold her tormentors accountable, but terror at the thought of what might happen to her if this moment of community courage collapsed back into the familiar patterns of fear and compliance. "Miss Lily," he said quietly, "you mentioned ledgers with records. Do you know where those books are kept?" The girl nodded hesitantly. "Mrs. Blackwood keeps hers in the safe behind her desk at the laundry office. Dr. Sterling's are in his medical bag, which he takes everywhere. And Mayor Hartwell has the big ledger with all the government contracts in his office at the town hall." Jake filed this information away while considering his options. If the records Lily described actually existed, they would provide the kind of concrete evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy. But obtaining such evidence would require more than moral courage. It would require careful planning and probably some degree of official backing to avoid charges of theft or breaking and entering. Mrs. Blackwood had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Sheriff Murphy, I believe we've heard quite enough wild accusations for one day. This child is clearly delusional, and Mr. Thompson is encouraging her fantasies for reasons I can only imagine. I suggest we end this spectacle before it gets completely out of hand." But Murphy was studying the faces around him with the calculating expression of a politician who'd suddenly realized that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. A substantial portion of Cedar Falls' voting population was present and clearly unhappy with the official explanations they'd been receiving. Arresting people for asking questions about missing children could have serious political consequences, especially if higher authorities began investigating the circumstances. "Mrs. Blackwood," Murphy said carefully, "maybe we should consider calling in territorial authorities to conduct a proper investigation. If everything's been handled according to law, an official review would clear up these misunderstandings once and for all." The suggestion clearly horrified both Mrs. Blackwood and Dr. Sterling. An outside investigation was exactly what their system couldn't survive, particularly if investigators gained access to the financial records that documented their systematic fraud and murder. "That seems unnecessarily provocative," Dr. Sterling interjected quickly. "Bringing in outside authorities based on the unsupported accusations of a disturbed child would be irresponsible and potentially damaging to our community's reputation." Jake recognized the moment as a turning point. The officials were beginning to turn on each other, their unified front cracking under pressure as each person began calculating individual survival over collective defense. Sheriff Murphy's suggestion of an outside investigation indicated that he was considering abandoning his partners in favor of positioning himself as a reasonable law enforcement officer who'd been misled by corrupt associates. "I think Sheriff Murphy's right," Jake said loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "An official investigation would clear up all these questions one way or another. If Lily's accusations are false, an investigation will prove it. If they're true, then justice needs to be done." The statement forced everyone present to choose sides publicly. Supporting an investigation meant accepting that serious crimes might have been committed. Opposing it suggested either guilt or willingness to protect guilty parties. The crowd's reaction was immediate and telling, a murmur of agreement that indicated most people wanted answers more than they feared the consequences of finding them. Mrs. Blackwood made one final attempt to regain control. "An investigation based on wild stories would be a waste of territorial resources and an insult to our community's reputation. I propose that we handle this matter internally through proper local channels, as responsible citizens should." But Rosa Martinez was no longer intimidated by appeals to respectability and proper channels. Mrs. Blackwood, the proper local channels are exactly what got us into this situation. I think it's time for some improper channels that might actually get us some honest answers." Her response drew nervous laughter from several people in the crowd, a sound that indicated the emotional atmosphere was shifting from fear and anger towards something that might eventually become resolve. Jake could sense the moment when a collection of individuals became a community united around shared values, and he recognized that whatever happened next would be determined by collective will rather than official authority. Mayor Edmund Hartwell chose that moment to arrive on the scene, having apparently been summoned by someone who recognized that the situation required his personal attention. He was a man in his 50s with the soft build and expensive clothes that suggested prosperity built on other people's labor, and he approached the confrontation with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his presence change the dynamics of any situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in the practiced voice of a politician addressing constituents, "I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding here today. Perhaps we could discuss these concerns in a more appropriate setting, where cooler heads can prevail and proper procedures can be followed." The arrival of Cedar Falls' highest elected official should have been decisive in favor of the established order. Instead, it seemed to galvanize the crowd's determination to demand accountability from their leadership. Jake could see people straightening their shoulders and stepping closer together, as if Hartwell's presence reminded them that they were the ones who'd given these officials their authority in the first place. "Mayor Hartwell," Martha Henderson called out with the forthright manner of someone who decided that deference was no longer appropriate. "We've been asking questions about what's happened to the missing children in our town. Perhaps you could provide some clear answers." Hartwell's expression suggested he'd been briefed on the situation during his journey to the scene. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand your concerns, but I think you'll find that all of our procedures regarding orphan children have been conducted in strict accordance with territorial law and medical best practices. If there are specific questions about documentation or procedures, I'd be happy to address them through proper official channels." The response was pure political deflection, designed to sound responsive while providing no actual information. But the crowd was no longer in a mood to accept such evasions. Jake could see impatience and anger building in the faces around him, along with the particular determination that arose when people realized they'd been consistently lied to by officials they'd trusted. "Mr. Mayor," said a voice from the back of the crowd, "what happened to the Peterson boy who used to work at the grain elevator? He was there 1 week and gone the next, and nobody would explain where he went." "And what about the Chinese girl who helped at the hotel?" called another voice. "Sarah Lou, I think her name was, disappeared right around Christmas, and the manager said she'd been transferred to another location, but nobody ever saw her again. What about Tommy Morrison? And the Kowalski twins? And that quiet boy who helped at the church?" The questions came faster now, a litany of names and disappearances that painted a picture of systematic elimination that had been going on for months or years. Each name that emerged from the crowd carried with it the weight of a young life extinguished, and Jake could see the cumulative impact hitting Mayor Hartwell like physical blows. The politician's confident demeanor was cracking under the pressure of specific accusations that couldn't be dismissed as general hysteria or misunderstanding. "These are serious allegations," Hartwell said, his voice losing some of its practiced authority. "If there are genuine concerns about specific individuals, I assure you that proper investigations will be conducted through appropriate channels." But the crowd was past accepting promises of future action. Rosa Martinez stepped forward again, her café apron still fluttering like a battle flag in the afternoon breeze. "Mayor Hartwell, we don't want promises anymore. We want answers now. And we want to see those records that Lily mentioned, the ones that supposedly document where all these children went and why." The demand for immediate access to documentation created a crisis moment for the conspiracy. The officials could no longer deflect with vague promises or medical explanations. They were being asked to produce evidence that would either vindicate or destroy their entire operation. Jake could see desperation beginning to replace calculation in their expressions as they realized that the community's patience with official explanations had been exhausted. Dr. Sterling made one last attempt to reassert medical authority. The medical records you're demanding are confidential patient information protected by territorial privacy laws. I cannot and will not violate my professional obligations by releasing sensitive medical documentation to satisfy mob curiosity. But Jake had spent enough time around frontier communities to understand their practical attitudes toward legal technicalities. Dr. Sterling, if these children died of natural causes, their families and friends have a right to know where they're buried and how they died. Medical privacy doesn't extend to hiding death certificates from people who cared about the deceased. The observation struck home with devastating effectiveness. Several people in the crowd nodded agreement, and Jake could see others beginning to understand the implications of what he'd said. If the missing children had died from legitimate medical conditions, their deaths would have been public events requiring proper documentation and burial procedures. The secrecy surrounding their disappearances suggested something far more sinister than routine medical care. Sheriff Murphy seemed to recognize that the situation was spinning beyond anyone's ability to control through normal intimidation tactics. Mayor, maybe we should consider Mr. Thompson's suggestion about calling in territorial authorities. If everything's been handled properly, an outside investigation would clear this up quickly. The sheriff's apparent willingness to submit to outside scrutiny sent visible shock waves through his co-conspirators. Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale, while Dr. Sterling looked like a man watching his professional reputation crumble in real time. Mayor Hartwell's expression suggested he was calculating whether Murphy could be trusted, or whether the sheriff was positioning himself to betray his partners in exchange for immunity. That won't be necessary, Hartwell said firmly. Cedar Falls is perfectly capable of handling internal matters without outside interference. However, I'm willing to convene a special town meeting where these concerns can be addressed in a proper forum with adequate documentation. Jake recognized the maneuver immediately. A special meeting would give the conspirators time to destroy evidence, coordinate their stories, and potentially eliminate witnesses who posed threats to their operation. Lily's life expectancy would be measured in hours if the officials regained control of the situation long enough to silence her permanently. With respect, Mayor Hartwell, Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I don't think Miss Lily can wait for a special meeting. She needs food, medical attention, and protection from people who've already tried to kill her once. Those seem like immediate concerns that require immediate action. The blunt accusation of attempted murder created another moment of crystalline tension. Jake had moved beyond diplomatic language into direct confrontation, forcing everyone present to acknowledge the true nature of what they were discussing. This wasn't about administrative procedures or medical protocols. It was about whether Cedar Falls would continue to permit the systematic murder of children by officials they'd elected and trusted. Lily chose that moment to speak again, her young voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet street. Mr. Jake's right. They mean to kill me tonight if they get the chance. Mrs. Blackwood told me yesterday that tomorrow's problems have a way of solving themselves if people mind their own business. The threat was so blatant and chilling that it sent a collective shudder through the assembled crowd. Even people who might have been willing to accept abstract explanations about medical necessity were confronted with the stark reality of a child who'd been directly threatened with death for speaking inconvenient truths. Martha Henderson's voice shook with outrage when she responded, Mrs. Blackwood, did you actually threaten to kill this child? Mrs. Blackwood drew herself up with injured dignity. I most certainly did not make any such threat. The child is clearly delusional and interpreting routine administrative discussions as personal attacks. But her denial lacked conviction, and Jake could see that most of the crowd didn't believe her. The accumulation of evidence and testimony had created a narrative that was too consistent and too detailed to dismiss as delusion or misunderstanding. Cedar Falls was being forced to confront the reality that their leadership had been systematically murdering the community's most vulnerable members, while hiding behind bureaucratic language and medical authority. "There's one way to settle this," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Jake turned to see a man in clerical clothing stepping forward, his white collar identifying him as Father Michael O'Brien from the Catholic Church. The priest's presence added another dimension to the confrontation, bringing moral authority to bear alongside community outrage. "Father O'Brien," Mayor Hartwell said with obvious relief, "perhaps you could help us restore some calm and reason to this situation." But the priest's expression suggested he wasn't planning to support the established order. "Mayor Hartwell, I've been hearing confessions and conducting burials in this community for 8 years. In that time, I've buried exactly 3 children who supposedly died from the medical conditions Dr. Sterling has been documenting. Yet according to my own records, more than 20 children have disappeared from Cedar Falls during the same period." The statistical discrepancy was damning. If children were dying from legitimate medical causes, their bodies would require proper burial in consecrated ground with appropriate religious ceremonies. The fact that most disappearances hadn't resulted in funerals suggested that the children weren't dying in any conventional sense. They were being murdered and their bodies disposed of secretly. Dr. Sterling's face had gone ashen. "Father O'Brien, I'm sure there are explanations for any administrative discrepancies. Perhaps some families chose private burial ceremonies, or children were transferred to medical facilities in other communities. But the priest was prepared for such evasions. Dr. Sterling, I maintain correspondence with clergy throughout this region, and I've made inquiries about missing children from Cedar Falls. None of my colleagues have any record of treating or burying children who were supposedly transferred for medical care." The methodical nature of Father O'Brien's investigation suggested that suspicions about the missing children had been building for months or years among people who kept careful records and communicated with each other regularly. The priest hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of wrongdoing. He'd been systematically documenting it and building a case that could withstand official scrutiny. Jake felt hope building in his chest as he realized that Cedar Falls, community of decent people, had been preparing for this moment longer than the conspirators had suspected. The opposition to the child-killing operation wasn't spontaneous mob fury. It was organized resistance that had been gathering strength and evidence, while waiting for the right catalyst to bring everything into the open. "Father," Jake said respectfully, "do you have documentation of these inquiries? Records that could be presented to territorial authorities?" Father O'Brien nodded gravely. "I've been maintaining detailed correspondence files for the past 3 years, documenting every inquiry about missing children and every response I've received from other communities. The pattern that emerges is impossible to explain through legitimate medical transfers or family relocations. The existence of independent documentation changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The conspirators could no longer rely on controlling local narratives or destroying evidence, because outside parties had been systematically recording information that corroborated the accusations being made. Any territorial investigation would find a paper trail that extended far beyond Cedar Falls boundaries. Mrs. Blackwood seemed to recognize the implications immediately. "Father O'Brien, I'm surprised that a man of God would participate in spreading malicious rumors based on incomplete information and emotional hysteria." But the priest was unmoved by appeals to religious authority. "Mrs. Blackwood, my obligations as a man of God require me to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. 20 missing children have voices that demand to be heard, even if their bodies cannot be found. The exchange between Mrs. Blackwood and Father O'Brien crystallized the moral dimensions of the conflict in ways that transcended political or legal considerations. This was fundamentally a battle between people who viewed children as human beings deserving protection and people who viewed them as economic assets to be exploited and disposed of when convenient. The priest's willingness to risk his position and reputation by publicly challenging the local power structure demonstrated that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. Jake looked around at the faces surrounding them and saw something that hadn't been there when this confrontation began. Instead of the fearful uncertainty that had characterized the crowd's initial reaction, he now saw determination hardening into resolve. Cedar Falls was discovering that it possessed the collective strength to demand accountability from its leadership, and that discovery was proving intoxicating for people who'd spent too long accepting explanations they knew were false. "I have a suggestion," Jake announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found his purpose. "Why don't we all walk over to Mrs. Blackwood's laundry office right now and ask to see those ledgers that Miss Lily mentioned? If the records show legitimate business operations, this entire matter can be cleared up immediately." The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for officials to produce evidence on their own terms, the community could demand immediate access to documentation that would either vindicate or condemn the accused parties. It was the kind of direct action that bypassed bureaucratic delays and forced immediate accountability. Mayor Hartwell stepped forward quickly. "That would be highly irregular and potentially illegal. Private business records cannot be seized without proper warrants and legal procedures." But Rosa Martinez had clearly moved beyond respecting such procedural objections. "Mayor, if Mrs. Blackwood has nothing to hide, she should be willing to show us records that prove these children were treated properly. Unless there's some reason she doesn't want us to see what's in those books." The challenge was direct and unavoidable. Mrs. Blackwood could either agree to open her records for inspection or appear to be hiding evidence of wrongdoing. Either choice carried risks, but refusing inspection would effectively confirm the accusations in the minds of most community members. Mrs. Blackwood's response revealed the desperation underlying her previous confidence. "This is preposterous. I will not submit to mob intimidation or allow private property to be violated based on the fantasies of a disturbed child." But her refusal to permit inspection had exactly the effect Rosa Martinez had anticipated. Murmurs of suspicion rippled through the crowd, and Jake could see people drawing their own conclusions about why someone would refuse to provide evidence that could clear their name. "Mrs. Blackwood," Father O'Brien said with gentle authority, "if you've been conducting legitimate business operations, surely you'd want to clear your name of these serious accusations. Transparency would serve your interests better than secrecy." The priest's reasonable tone made Mrs. Blackwood's defensiveness appear even more suspicious. She was being offered multiple opportunities to vindicate herself through simple disclosure, and her continued refusal suggested that the records would reveal exactly what Lily had claimed they contained. Sheriff Murphy seemed to recognize that. His political survival required separating himself from his increasingly isolated co-conspirators. "Mrs. Blackwood, maybe showing the books wouldn't be such a bad idea. If everything's legitimate, it would put these rumors to rest once and for all." The sheriff's apparent willingness to examine evidence created a new crisis for the conspiracy. Murphy controlled local law enforcement, and his cooperation would be essential for any cover-up attempts. If he was beginning to distance himself from the operation, the other conspirators would find themselves without protection from potential prosecution. Dr. Sterling made one final attempt to prevent the exposure of evidence. "Sheriff Murphy, as the medical authority in this situation, I must insist that proper legal procedures be followed. Irregular inspections could compromise ongoing medical treatments and violate patient confidentiality. But Murphy was clearly calculating his own survival over loyalty to his partners. "Doc, if there are legitimate medical reasons for the procedures you've been conducting, proper documentation should support your decisions. I don't see any harm in reviewing records that prove everything was handled according to law." The sheriff's response effectively ended any pretense of unified resistance from the conspirators. Murphy was positioning himself as a reasonable law enforcement officer who'd been misled by others, leaving his former partners to face community anger without official protection. Jake sensed that the moment for decisive action had arrived. "Sheriff Murphy, as the law enforcement authority here, would you be willing to escort us to Mrs. Blackwood's office so we can examine those records? That would ensure everything's done properly while still getting the answers people need." The request was perfectly reasonable and virtually impossible to refuse without appearing to obstruct justice. Murphy found himself in the position of either cooperating with the community's demand for transparency or appearing to protect potentially criminal activities. "I suppose that would be acceptable," Murphy said reluctantly, "provided we follow proper procedures and respect property rights." His agreement sent visible shock through Mrs. Blackwood and Dr. Sterling, who suddenly realized they'd been abandoned by their primary source of official protection. The conspiracy that had seemed so secure that morning was crumbling under the cosum pressure of community resistance and internal betrayal. Mrs. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Sheriff Murphy, I absolutely forbid this invasion of private property. If you participate in this illegal search, I'll file formal complaints with territorial authorities about your conduct." But Murphy had clearly decided that his future lay with the community rather than with the conspirators. "Ma'am, with respect, examining business records related to public contracts and territorial funding falls within my legitimate law enforcement responsibilities. If you refuse to cooperate with a lawful investigation, I'll have to consider that obstruction of justice." The threat of arrest for obstruction created the final break in Mrs. Blackwood's resistance. She could either submit to record inspection or face immediate legal consequences that would guarantee territorial investigation regardless of her preferences. "This is outrageous," she said, but the fight had gone out of her voice. "Very well. But I want it noted that this examination is being conducted under duress and against my explicit protests." Her capitulation sent a surge of excitement through the assembled crowd. After years of accepting official explanations and looking the other way when children disappeared, Cedar Falls was finally going to see evidence of what had really been happening in their community. Jake looked down at Lily, who was watching these developments with a mixture of hope and terror. "Miss Lily, would you be willing to come with us and help identify the records you mentioned? You'd be under Sheriff Murphy's protection, so nobody could harm you for telling the truth." The girl's grip tightened on his hand, but she nodded with the courage of someone who'd already faced worse than whatever might come next. "Yes, sir. I want people to see what they've been doing to us." As the crowd began moving toward the laundry building, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He'd committed himself and Lily to a course of action that would either expose systematic murder or destroy both their credibility permanently. There would be no neutral outcome now. Either justice would prevail, or the conspirators would succeed in silencing their accusers forever. The procession that moved down Cedar Falls Main Street resembled nothing so much as a trial by community judgment, with the entire population serving as jury and the accused parties being marched toward evidence that would determine their fate. It was frontier justice in its purest form, direct, immediate, and accountable to the people most affected by the crimes being investigated. As they approached Mrs. Blackwood's laundry office, Jake could see other children peering fearfully from windows and doorways, too frightened to approach but clearly aware that something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in years, someone was demanding accountability for their treatment, and their young faces showed the desperate hope of people who'd given up believing that rescue was possible. The reckoning that Cedar Falls had been avoiding was finally at hand, and Jake Thompson found himself at the center of events that would determine whether a community could rediscover its conscience in time to save the children it had abandoned. Part 5. The Hero's Defining Choice. The laundry building stood at the edge of Cedar Falls commercial district, like a monument to systematic exploitation. Its brick walls and tall windows designed to project prosperity built on other people's labor. As the crowd approached the structure, Jake could hear the sounds of machinery and children's voices from within, evidence that the business operations continued, even while its owner was being marched toward exposure by an increasingly angry community. Mrs. Blackwood walked ahead of the group with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain dignity while facing inevitable humiliation. Her expensive dress and carefully arranged hair contrasted sharply with the working clothes and sun-weathered faces of the people surrounding her, visual evidence of the economic disparities that had made the exploitation possible in the first place. Sheriff Murphy stayed close beside her, his hand resting on his weapon more for protection than intimidation, now that he'd chosen sides in the developing conflict. Jake kept Lily close as they entered the building, acutely aware that bringing her back to the site of her abuse carried significant emotional risks. The girl's breathing had grown shallow and rapid as they approached the entrance, and he could feel tension radiating from her small frame like heat from a forge. But when he quietly asked if she wanted to wait outside, she shook her head with the determined courage of someone who decided that facing her fears was better than letting them control her future. The interior of the laundry revealed the true nature of Mrs. Blackwood's operation with stark clarity. Rows of industrial washing machines dominated the main floor, each one tended by children who looked far too young to be handling such dangerous equipment safely. The air was thick with steam and the harsh smell of lye soap, while the constant noise of machinery made conversation difficult without shouting. Most disturbing of all were the working conditions themselves. Children as young as 8 or 9 operating equipment that could easily kill or maim them if they made mistakes or lost concentration due to exhaustion. The arrival of such a large group of adults clearly terrified the working children, who immediately stopped their activities and huddled together in defensive clusters. Their reaction spoke volumes about how they'd been trained to view adult attention as something that usually meant trouble rather than help. Several of the older children moved protectively in front of the younger ones, creating human shields with their own bodies in a gesture that revealed both their understanding of danger and their commitment to protecting each other. Father O'Brien stepped forward with the gentle authority that came with years of working with frightened children. "It's all right," he said in a voice that carried clearly over the machinery noise. "Nobody's here to hurt anyone. We just need to look at some records to make sure everyone's being treated properly." His reassurance seemed to ease some of the children's immediate terror, though they remained watchful and ready to flee if the situation deteriorated. Jake could see recognition in several young faces as they spotted Lily among the adults, and he wondered how many of these children had been expecting to join her in wearing condemnation signs if they became inconvenient to their exploiters. Mrs. Blackwood led the group toward a small office at the rear of the building, her movements becoming increasingly reluctant as they approached the source of evidence that would either vindicate or destroy her. The office itself was spartanly furnished but well organized, with filing cabinets, a heavy safe, and a desk covered with ledgers and correspondence that suggested extensive record-keeping practices. "The safe combination," Sheriff Murphy said. "Without preamble, if you please, ma'am." Mrs. Blackwood's hands shook slightly as she worked the combination, but the safe opened to reveal exactly what Lily had described: multiple ledgers filled with names, dates, and financial figures that documented the systematic exploitation of orphan children. The books were organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that successful criminals often employ to track their profitable enterprises. Rosa Martinez was the first to examine the opened ledgers, her cafe experience having given her the practical accounting skills needed to interpret financial records quickly. What she found made her face go pale with shock and revulsion. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet office. "They've been tracking these children like livestock. Names, ages, work assignments, earnings generated, and—" She paused, her voice catching as she read further. "And disposal dates for the ones who stopped being profitable." The clinical language used to document murder was perhaps more horrifying than emotional descriptions would have been. The conspirators had reduced child killing to administrative procedures, complete with cost-benefit analyses and efficiency metrics that treated human lives as nothing more than economic variables to be optimized. Father O'Brien took the ledger from Rosa's trembling hands and began reading aloud in a voice that carried the authority of someone bearing witness to systematic evil. Entry dated March 15th. Subject L. Peterson, age 14. Assigned to grain elevator. Operations. Medical determination. Declining productivity due to respiratory complications. Recommended disposal method. Standard protocol. Estimated cost savings. $47 per month in food and housing expenses. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality of what was being described: the deliberate murder of a 14-year-old boy whose only crime had been developing health problems that made him less profitable to exploit. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, with several people expressing outrage and others demanding to know what standard protocol meant in practical terms. Dr. Sterling attempted one final deception. "Those are obviously code words for medical transfer procedures. Standard protocol refers to transferring children to specialized medical facilities when their conditions require treatment beyond our local capabilities." But Lily had found her voice and her courage. "That's a lie," she said clearly, stepping forward to address the assembled adults. "I know what standard protocol means because I've seen it. They take the children out to the old mine shafts in the hills at night. They don't come back." Her testimony was delivered with the matter-of-fact precision of someone reporting events she'd witnessed rather than speculating about possibilities. The directness of her statement and the specific details she provided made denial impossible for anyone willing to listen to evidence rather than official explanations. Jake felt something fundamental shift inside his chest as the full scope of the atrocity became clear. This wasn't just a case of economic exploitation or even individual cruelty. It was systematic genocide directed against the community's most vulnerable members, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency and justified through medical authority. The children of Cedar Falls had been treated as disposable resources, killed when they became inconvenient and erased from official records as if they'd never existed. The moment crystallized his understanding of what this confrontation really meant. He could walk away now with the satisfaction of having exposed the truth, leave Cedar Falls to deal with the consequences while he moved on to whatever came next in his wandering life. Or he could commit himself fully to ensuring that justice was done and that no more children died while adults looked the other way. The choice was more complex than simple moral arithmetic. Staying meant accepting responsibility, not just for Lily's immediate safety, but for reforming an entire system that had normalized child murder. It meant fighting battles in courtrooms and political meetings, dealing with territorial authorities and federal investigators, and probably spending months or years in Cedar Falls while legal proceedings ground toward uncertain conclusions. It also meant accepting the possibility of forming attachments to people and places that could be lost to violence or circumstance, risking the kind of emotional investment that had caused him so much pain during and after the war. The safe path was still available: expose the truth, ensure Lily's immediate rescue, and then disappear before the complications of long-term commitment could take root. But as Jake looked around the office at the faces of people who'd found their courage and chosen to act despite years of fear and intimidation, he realized that some moments demanded more than tactical calculation. Sometimes a man had to decide whether he wanted to be someone who walked away from injustice or someone who stayed to fight it, regardless of personal cost. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his internal deliberation. Through the office window, Jake could see a group of armed riders approaching the laundry building at speed, their purposeful movement suggesting they weren't casual visitors arriving by coincidence. Mrs. Blackwood's face showed relief mixed with calculation, as if she recognized the newcomers and believed they might represent salvation from her current predicament. Reinforcements, Sheriff Murphy observed grimly, his earlier cooperation apparently forgotten as he reassessed his options. Looks like Mayor Hartwell decided to call in some outside help. The approaching riders numbered at least 8 men, all well-armed and moving with the disciplined coordination that suggested either military training or extensive experience with organized violence. Their arrival transformed the situation from community confrontation to potential armed conflict, raising stakes that had already been measured in children's lives to include the possibility of widespread bloodshed. Jake felt Lily's hand tighten in his as the sound of horses grew louder. The girl had survived months of systematic abuse and nearly died from deliberate starvation. But now she faced the prospect of being silenced permanently by people who viewed her testimony as an existential threat to their profitable operations. "Miss Lily," he said quietly, "I need you to stay close to Father O'Brien and Mrs. Martinez. Whatever happens next, don't let anyone separate you from them." The girl looked up at him with eyes that held far too much understanding for her age. "They're going to try to kill you too, aren't they? Because you helped me?" The question carried implications that extended beyond personal danger. If Jake was eliminated along with Lily, the community resistance that had emerged so dramatically that afternoon might collapse back into the familiar patterns of fear and compliance that had allowed the murders to continue for so long. His death would serve as an object lesson about the costs of challenging established authority, ensuring that future potential rescuers would think twice before intervening. "Maybe," Jake replied honestly, "but sometimes standing up to bullies is the only way to make them stop bullying people. And I've been running from fights for too long to start giving up now." The admission surprised him with its truth. He had been running from responsibility, from commitment, from the possibility of loss, and ultimately from himself. The war had taught him that caring about people and causes made a man vulnerable to pain that could destroy his ability to function. But isolation and emotional distance had their own costs, and Jake was discovering that a life spent avoiding attachment was really just another form of death. The armed riders reached the building and dismounted with efficient movements that confirmed their professional nature. These weren't local deputies or concerned citizens. They were hired guns brought in specifically to handle situations that required violence without legal constraints. Their presence meant that the conspirators had anticipated exposure and prepared contingency plans that involved eliminating witnesses and intimidating the community back into silence. Mayor Hartwell entered the office flanked by 2 of the gunmen, his confident demeanor restored now that he had superior firepower backing his authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid this unauthorized assembly has gotten completely out of hand. For public safety reasons, I'm ordering everyone to disperse immediately and return to their homes." The order was backed by obvious threats of violence. But Jake could see that the community members weren't automatically retreating. The courage they'd found that afternoon had been tested by genuine fear and proven stronger than their survival instincts. People who'd discovered they could stand up to corrupt authority weren't ready to surrender that power just because the opposition had escalated to direct intimidation. "Mayor Hartwell," Father O'Brien said with the moral authority that came with his religious position, "we've discovered evidence of systematic murder in these records. Surely you don't expect us to simply ignore crimes of this magnitude. But Hartwell was no longer interested in maintaining facades of legitimacy. Father, you've been misled by the fantasies of a disturbed child and the inflammatory rhetoric of a dangerous stranger. I'm ordering you to leave these premises immediately and cease spreading malicious rumors that could damage our community's reputation. The confrontation had reached its final phase. Either the community would back down in the face of armed intimidation, or they would commit themselves to fighting for justice regardless of personal risk. Jake could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, with everything that followed depending on whether ordinary people could find the courage to resist, when resistance might cost them their lives. That was when Jake Thompson made the choice. That would define not just his own future, but the fate of every vulnerable person in Cedar Falls. Instead of calculating odds or looking for escape routes, he stepped forward to place himself between the armed men and the community members who'd found their courage. "Mayor," he said with quiet authority, "I think you'd better reconsider your position. Because this situation has moved beyond local politics into federal territory, and threatening witnesses to child murder is the kind of mistake that brings territorial authorities down on everyone involved." The declaration was both warning and challenge, forcing Hartwell to decide whether he was willing to commit to open violence against people who'd already begun documenting evidence that could destroy him. Jake was betting that the mayor's political instincts would recognize the difference between controllable local problems and the kind of territorial scandal that could end careers and result in federal prosecution. But he was also prepared for the possibility that desperate men might choose violence over surrender, and his hand rested ready near his weapon as he waited to see whether Cedar Falls would find justice through courage or pay for it with blood. The tension in Mrs. Blackwood's office stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap, with 8 armed men facing down a crowd of determined townspeople who'd finally found their courage after years of looking the other way. Jake could feel the weight of decision pressing down on everyone present, that crystalline moment when civilized pretenses fall away and people discover what they're truly willing to fight for when everything else has been stripped away. Mayor Hartwell's confident expression flickered as he processed Jake's warning about federal territory and territorial authorities. The mayor was a politician first and foremost, someone who'd built his career on calculating risks and avoiding consequences that could destroy his carefully constructed power base. The prospect of federal investigation represented exactly the kind of external scrutiny that could unravel not just his personal corruption, but the entire network of complicity that had allowed Cedar Falls' systematic child murder to continue unchallenged. "Mr. Thompson," Hartwell said with forced calm, "I think you're overestimating the significance of what's happening here. This is a local matter involving local people, and it will be resolved through local channels. Federal authorities have no interest in minor administrative irregularities in a small Montana town." But Jake had spent enough time around frontier politics to understand how territorial governance actually worked. Mayor, systematic murder of children using federal orphan care funds makes this a federal crime regardless of where it happens. And threatening witnesses to those crimes in front of a Catholic priest and half the town's population makes it the kind of scandal that ends political careers permanently. The observation sent visible shock through several of the hired gunmen, who'd presumably been told they were dealing with local troublemakers, rather than federal crimes that could result in territorial prosecution. Professional gunfighters understood the difference between local disputes that could be managed through intimidation and federal cases that brought U.S. Marshals with arrest warrants and extradition powers. Father O'Brien recognized the moment and stepped forward with the moral authority that came with his position. "Mayor Hartwell, I've already sent detailed correspondence to Bishop Morrison in Helena, describing the suspicious circumstances surrounding missing children in Cedar Falls. If anything happens to the witnesses who've come forward today, those Letters will trigger exactly the kind of investigation you seem anxious to avoid. The priest's revelation that outside religious authorities had already been alerted changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The conspirators could no longer simply eliminate local witnesses and return to business as usual. Their crimes were already documented beyond Cedar Falls boundaries, with copies of evidence in the hands of people who couldn't be intimidated or silenced through local pressure. Dr. Sterling's face had gone ashen as the implications sank in. His medical license and professional reputation were at stake, along with potential criminal charges that could result in imprisonment or execution, depending on how many deaths could be directly attributed to his fraudulent diagnoses. Unlike politicians who could sometimes survive scandals through clever maneuvering, doctors who were exposed as systematic murderers faced professional and legal consequences that were both immediate and irreversible. "This is preposterous," Sterling stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I've conducted legitimate medical examinations according to accepted territorial standards. Any investigation will vindicate my professional judgment and reveal these accusations as malicious fabrications." But Rosa Martinez had continued examining the ledgers while the confrontation developed, and her discoveries were demolishing any remaining pretense of medical legitimacy. "Dr. Sterling, according to these records, you've certified more than 30 children as suffering from fatal diseases during the past 2 years. But the symptoms you documented don't match any known medical conditions, and the progression timelines are completely inconsistent with legitimate diagnoses." Her analysis carried the authority of practical experience rather than formal medical training, but it was delivered with the kind of detailed precision that suggested careful study rather than emotional accusations. Rosa had clearly spent considerable time learning to interpret the medical language used to justify the murders, and her conclusions were devastating to Sterling's claims of professional legitimacy. "Furthermore," Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, "your own notes indicate that children who were supposedly dying from these diseases were still being assigned to heavy labor right up until their disposal dates. That's not consistent with end-stage medical conditions requiring compassionate care." The contradiction was so obvious and damning that even people without medical training could understand its implications. Children who were genuinely dying from serious diseases wouldn't be physically capable of performing the kind of demanding labor that the ledgers documented. Sterling's diagnoses were clearly fraudulent, designed to provide legal cover for murder, rather than legitimate medical assessments. Sheriff Murphy seemed to recognize that his political survival required distancing himself from increasingly obvious criminality. "Dr. Sterling, maybe you'd better explain these discrepancies to everyone's satisfaction. Because if these records show what they appear to show, we're looking at charges a lot more serious than administrative irregularities." Murphy's apparent willingness to investigate his former co-conspirators created a cascade of abandonment that left the core conspirators increasingly isolated. The sheriff controlled local law enforcement, and his cooperation with the investigation would make it virtually impossible for the other participants to escape accountability through official protection or evidence destruction. Mayor Hartwell recognized the deteriorating situation and made one final attempt to regain control through direct intimidation. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the hired gunman with obvious desperation, "I think it's time to restore order to this situation. Please escort these people out of the building so we can discuss these matters privately." But the lead gunman, a weathered professional named Clayton, who'd clearly dealt with similar situations before, was studying the faces around him with the calculating expression of someone reassessing the risk-reward ratio of his current employment. "Mayor, you said this was about removing a troublesome drifter and silencing a lying child. You didn't mention federal crimes or religious authorities, or half the town being involved in whatever's happening here." The gunman's reluctance to proceed revealed the limitations of hired violence when situations became too complex for simple intimidation. Professional killers understood the difference between manageable local problems and the kind of high-profile cases that brought sustained law enforcement attention. Clayton and his men had been hired to handle a discreet elimination, not to fight a small war against an entire community with federal backing. Jake sensed the moment when momentum shifted decisively in favor of justice. The hired guns were wavering, the local sheriff had switched sides, and the conspirators were being abandoned by their former allies as evidence of their crimes became undeniable. But he also understood that desperate people could become extremely dangerous when they realized they had nothing left to lose. "Mr. Clayton," Jake said, addressing the lead gunman directly, "I'm going to make you an offer. You and your men can ride out of Cedar Falls right now with no questions asked and no pursuit. Or you can stay and participate in federal crimes that will make you wanted men throughout the territory. Your choice." The offer was strategically brilliant, giving the hired guns a face-saving exit that removed the threat of violence while isolating the core conspirators from their primary source of protection. Clayton was clearly a professional who understood that survival required knowing when to withdraw from untenable situations. "Boys," Clayton said to his men without taking his eyes off Jake, "I think we've heard enough. This isn't what we signed up for, and it's time to collect our horses and find employment elsewhere." The withdrawal of the hired guns left Mayor Hartwell, Mrs. Blackwood, and Dr. Sterling facing the combined anger of an aroused community, without any means of physical intimidation or escape. Their carefully constructed system of control had collapsed in the space of a single afternoon, brought down by the simple willingness of ordinary people to demand accountability from their leadership. But Jake knew that exposure was only the beginning of justice. The conspirators could still attempt to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or escape to other territories where their crimes weren't known. Ensuring that the children of Cedar Falls received real protection would require sustained effort and careful coordination with territorial authorities who had the power to prosecute federal crimes. "Sheriff Murphy," Jake said, with the authority of someone who'd taken charge of the situation, "I think it's time to place these three under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against territorial government, and systematic abuse of children under their care." Murphy nodded grimly, understanding that his own survival required full cooperation with the investigation that was now inevitable. "Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Sterling, Mayor Hartwell, you're under arrest for multiple violations of territorial and federal law. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll want to start talking to federal investigators about who else might be involved in this operation." The arrests were conducted with surprising calm, perhaps because the accused parties understood that resistance would only make their situations worse. Mrs. Blackwood maintained her dignity through obvious effort, while Dr. Sterling appeared to be in shock at the rapid collapse of his professional reputation. Mayor Hartwell's face showed the particular despair of a politician who discovered that political maneuvering couldn't solve every problem. As the arrests were being completed, Lily stepped forward with the quiet courage that had characterized her throughout this ordeal. "Mr. Jake, there's something else you need to know. There are other children hidden in the mine shafts, still alive. They keep some of the older ones there for special work that certain men in town pay extra for." The revelation that additional children were being held in conditions that were probably worse than death created a new urgency that transcended the satisfaction of exposing the conspiracy. Rescue operations would need to be organized immediately, with careful coordination to ensure that panicked captors didn't harm their victims before help could arrive. Father O'Brien took charge of organizing the rescue effort with the same methodical competence he'd shown in documenting the crimes. "I know the mine locations Lily's describing. We'll need teams of men with ropes and lanterns. medical supplies for children who've been systematically abused, and probably food and clean water for people who haven't received proper care in months. The transformation of Cedar Falls from passive complicity to active resistance was remarkable to witness. People who'd spent years avoiding involvement in their community's darkest secrets were suddenly volunteering for dangerous rescue operations and offering their homes as temporary shelters for traumatized children. The exposure of systematic evil had awakened a collective conscience that had been suppressed by fear and intimidation. Jake found himself appointed as unofficial coordinator of the rescue operations, partly because of his role in exposing the crimes, but mostly because he'd demonstrated the kind of moral courage that people instinctively followed in crisis situations. It was a responsibility he accepted with full understanding of what it meant. He was no longer a drifter passing through Cedar Falls, but a permanent resident committed to seeing justice done, regardless of personal cost. The mine rescues took place over the following 3 days, revealing horrors that exceeded even the worst fears of the rescue teams. 17 children were found alive in conditions that defied description, their physical and psychological trauma requiring months of careful treatment and rehabilitation. But they were alive, and their testimonies provided additional evidence that would ensure comprehensive prosecution of everyone involved in the conspiracy. The federal investigation that followed was thorough and relentless, ultimately revealing a network of similar operations throughout the territory that had been systematically murdering orphaned and abandoned children while profiting from both their labor and the government funds intended for their care. Cedar Falls had been just one node in a larger web of corruption that extended into territorial government and federal bureaucracy. The trials that resulted from the investigation became landmark cases in territorial law, establishing precedents for federal prosecution of crimes against children and creating new oversight mechanisms for orphan care programs. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Sterling, and Mayor Hartwell were all convicted of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, receiving sentences that effectively ended their lives. But more importantly, their convictions sent clear messages throughout the territory that systematic abuse of vulnerable populations would no longer be tolerated by federal authorities. Jake Thompson never left Cedar Falls. What had begun as a temporary stop in his wandering life became a permanent commitment to rebuilding a community's conscience and ensuring that no more children suffered while adults looked the other way. He married Rosa Martinez 2 years later, adopting Lily as his daughter and helping her heal from traumas that would have destroyed weaker spirits. Lily Chen grew up to become Dr. Lily Thompson, specializing in the treatment of traumatized children and establishing programs throughout the territory that prevented the kind of systematic abuse she'd survived. Her work saved hundreds of lives and created models for child protection that influenced territorial and eventually state policy for generations. The orphanage that replaced Mrs. Blackwood's operation became a genuine refuge where children learned trades, received education, and grew up knowing they were valued members of their community rather than disposable assets to be exploited. Father O'Brien oversaw its operations with the same careful attention to justice that had exposed the original crimes, ensuring that accountability and transparency prevented future abuse. Cedar Falls itself was transformed from a place where systematic evil had been normalized into a community that took pride in protecting its most vulnerable members. The town became known throughout the territory as a place where justice mattered more than profit, where ordinary people had proven that extraordinary courage could triumph over institutional corruption. Jake often reflected on the moment when he'd first seen Lily sitting against that brick wall with her condemnation sign, and how easily he could have ridden past without stopping. The choice to intervene had seemed simple at the time, help a hungry child, but it had led to consequences that changed not just their lives, but the entire character of their community. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with armies and grand strategies, but with individual decisions to do what was right when doing nothing would have been easier. Sometimes justice required nothing more than one person willing to say that certain lines couldn't be crossed, that some cruelties wouldn't be tolerated, and that the weakest members of society deserved protection regardless of the cost. The sign that had once declared Lily not worth feeding was eventually displayed in the Territorial Museum as a reminder of how quickly civilized societies could descend into barbarism when good people chose silence over courage. But it was also displayed alongside photographs of the thriving community that Cedar Falls became when those same people chose to act on their conscience rather than their fears. In the end, the lonely cowboy had found something more valuable than temporary work or safe passage to the next town. He'd found a home worth fighting for, a family worth protecting, and a purpose that gave meaning to all the wandering years that had brought him to that dusty street where a child's life hung in the balance. And in saving her, he'd discovered that sometimes the person most in need of rescue was the one doing the rescuing. The story of Cedar Falls became legend throughout the territory, told and retold as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to stand together against injustice. It was the kind of story that inspired others to act when they encountered their own moments of moral choice, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the boundaries of one small Montana town. And somewhere in those rolling hills where children now played safely and families gathered without fear, the spirit of justice that had been awakened that August afternoon continued to burn brightly, a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that the world could be made better by people willing to do what was right when it mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.